Okay, I may have a lot to say about this one, though in a good way, actually a very good way. I really, really liked the recently released 28 Years Later. I thought it was great. I just got back from seeing it with a good friend of mine. I actually still have a vague handful of those, bizarrely enough, and I had a great time at the cinema. I'm very fond of the original, I've discussed it on the channel before, and I felt that this wholly lived up to the strengths of that film, and I may have even liked it a little more. I'll address this in a few informal dot points because there are no rules here when I write up these infernal pieces. I really appreciated the cinematographic approach. The apparent use of iPhones has given the quality of a floating ethereal spectre over the image, distinct from the grace and traditional symmetry which film cameras intuitively lend to the final editing schema, and which then renders the editing structure of 28 Years to be really quite original, admirably frenetic, and maybe even closer to reality than the more cinematic stylings of the medium's traditions, narratively. Now, the events playing out in front of the camera are certainly narratively incredibly cinematic, though the execution of several scenes reflects a particular immediacy and suddenness which cuts through the slightly contrived cinematic build ups of decades past and into something which sooner resembles a human being's data of consciousness. The world building atop the first film, and the sequel, which I never disliked, though never felt any major love for either, is intriguing, and though it may seem like the stuff of a comic book spin off somewhat, it is the stuff of a rather good comic book spin off. The idea for 28 Days Later, Garland has claimed, was inspired by his formative exposure to classic British sci fi anthology Comics Mag 2000 AD, so this shouldn't be too surprising, possibly. Great use of colour, lots of visceral horror set pieces, sufficiently tense and creepy, there is captivating imagery all around. Maybe because it is a 28 days film released in the current day, the last one was released way back in 2007. But wow, I feel as though these films represented a prophetic quality regarding a certain pathos of British culture. This may be a controversial point, and I'm not endorsing the validity of these beliefs, not in the slightest, quite frankly, but the potential relation of the events in these films to the vocal hysteria in Britain, to what could be termed the contemporary migrant crisis, there's an almost Adam Curtis quality, and we'll be discussing him again within the next week, ideally, to the cinematic universe of the 28 Days films, which forewarned of the issues with alleged invasion, disintegration of British ideals or values within a limited span of time, the accent keeping the culture alive and nothing else. And whilst I do not remotely subscribe to beliefs which assign any apocalyptic or, say, Powell-esque anxieties where any immigration to the UK is concerned, these films can be said to manifest an unconscious fear regarding either the rapid dissolution of the British culture and system, the mauling of within by an energised swarming via the population, or for just being the nation, the most influential nation on world culture, potentially, given its own influence upon the United States culture, that consumed itself from within whilst its satellites, America, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, wherever, presumably still survive and attempt to flourish whilst the home nation burns to the ground. If you're appalled I could even suggest this, perhaps I was watching these too closely to the vicinity of viewing the new Adam Curtis series Shifty and imagining the anxieties represented, at least in his 2021 work Can't Get You Out of My Head, being illustrated by clips from 28 Days Later or now 28 Years Later. As far as horror cinema goes, whilst the goal is always very similar with horror films over the last just over a century now, the execution is always evolving with the film medium, as the cutting edge techniques of film are always employed to fully realize the sensory effect of a horror moment in one of these films. Inept horror films are often cited as the worst films, whilst the best executed, well, Caligari, Nosferatu, Frankenstein, Vampire, Psycho, Mario Bava, Exorcist, Halloween, Shining, The Thing. Yeah, you're getting the idea. Some of the most revered films of the 20th century. The medium must be most assertively employed in the horror genre, which is why I possibly enjoy this genre more than any other of this medium. If I have any complaints, they are related to simple conveniences of the narrative. One, I don't buy the motivation of the 12-year-old protagonist to take his sick or dying mother to a doctor alleged to be alive hiding on the mainland, considering the likelihood of her death and his is certain or near certain if they set foot on the mainland. Or maybe not, because two, they were way too lucky finding that doctor, played by Ray Fiennes, and those infected were sometimes further away than I think an initial frame or edit suggested. But whatever, I was enjoying the movie and didn't want it to be over in 40 minutes, so I can forgive these things. But yeah, I had a great time. This might plausibly end up being one of my picks for most liked on my end film of the year. Big appraisal on my end. AOD endorses 28 years later. God, it's one of Danny Boyle's an interesting case. I haven't liked too many of his films aside from the two most well known and celebrated. I love Train Spotting. I've made that clear before on the channel. And I'm fond of, as I said, the original 28 Days Later. Shallow Grave is okay, a bit predictable, I feel. I want to watch Sunshine again. I always thought it was a sort of a far cry from the slower, more contemplative, space station flicks, like, spaceship flicks, I suppose more accurately, especially if you're considering 2001, the original Alien, or Solaris. Well, that's why I said space station, because that's the one that is set on a space station. But, it is a far cry from those at the end of the day. But Sunshine certainly has merits, which I have possibly been a bit ignorant of, or at least needlessly unappreciative of over the years. But yeah, aside from that, I don't know if I'm the biggest fan of a lot of Boyle's films, sadly. If you're umming and ahhing about whether to go see it, go ahead and see it. I reckon you might have a great time. Thank you very much. Have a good night, everyone. Thank you.